Hello, friends. It's Saturday morning in Colorado, and I wanted to get this video out before I take care of some Saturday chores. I'm sure you have some Saturday chores, right? Well, I've got a long list, and I need to get them finished before OU takes on Kansas State this afternoon. Maybe I'll be able to watch a little bit of that game. Anyway, we're not here to talk about football, are we? We're here to talk about the passages that we read in Philippians this week. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 24. Last week, you recall, we were talking about this beautiful passage in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And of course, that passage is about Jesus, who he is, his identity, and the fact that he poured himself out, even to death on a cross, for the sake of other people, for our sake. This, of course, is the great passage of his emptying, his kenosis, we might say. He emptied himself. He poured out himself. And you know, because of the splendor of that passage, it's easy to forget its aim. How does Paul intend to use that passage? Well, he uses the passage to encourage the Philippians to imitate Jesus. What was his command in chapter 2 and verse 5? Let's have the mind of Christ. Have the mind of Christ in you is what he wants us to do and the Philippians to do. And this mind was to be interested in other people, to be willing to pour oneself out for the sake of other people. Well, in our passages this week, Paul is applying that example of the life of Christ, that emptying of Christ. He's applying that to the situation in Philippi. So, how does he apply that passage, and what does he want these Philippians to do? I think verse 12 summarizes it well. He wants them to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. Now, what's the meaning of that passage? I think we should notice, first of all, that Paul is writing this to the whole church in Philippi. He's not writing it to individuals. And so, this is a corporate imperative, not an individual one. That is, he wants the whole church to work out their salvation. And I don't believe he's talking about the fact of their works contributing to their salvation. I think the way to read that passage is, because of their salvation, he wants them to live a certain way. We might say that he's asking them to live out their salvation in the world. Here is, the concern here is with their being God's people in Philippi. So, how do they live out or work out the salvation that they have already experienced? Well, they live it out by living without murmuring, without complaining, and without arguing. Verse 14. They live it out by shining like stars in the world. They live it out by holding out the word of life for the people in Philippi. It's an evangelistic passage here. They live it out by being willing to suffer for the sake of their faith. Verse 17. They live it out by living joyful lives. Verse 18. But principally, they live out their salvation by being interested in others more than they are interested in themselves. That's what Paul is trying to encourage them to do. And so when we get into verse 19, he's going to use Timothy as a second model for what that looks like. Our first model was Jesus Christ, who poured out himself in the interests of others. Now he's going to bring up Timothy as someone who pours out his life and has an unselfish concern for other people. And what is exemplary about Timothy in this passage? Well, it is that he is genuinely concerned for the welfare of the Philippians. He doesn't seek his own interests. He seeks the interests of Christ. And in this context, by the way, I want you to notice that the interests of Jesus Christ are being genuinely concerned about the interests of others. Does that make sense? What does it mean to be concerned for the interests of Jesus Christ? It means being concerned for the interests and welfare of my neighbor and the people around me. I think that's what Paul is teaching here. So, let's talk briefly about application. Paul's description of Timothy, especially as it stands in contrast to those in Rome who out of rivalry are trying to increase Paul's affliction, chapter 1, verse 17, lies at the heart of what Paul understands the Christian life to be all about. What is the Christian life all about? It's being interested in the concerns of others, the welfare of others. Now, can you imagine a more powerful antidote for the number of struggles that consistently plague a local church than this antidote? What if we were more interested in other people than we were in ourselves? What if we put their concerns and their welfare above our own? That would be the perfect antidote to the struggles that plague us. God's people putting the interests of others as of first importance, that would make quite an impact in the world, don't you think? So if we were to humble ourselves and pour ourselves out in the service of others and put the welfare of others above our own, in other words, if we were to take the way of the cross, what an impact we would have on our world. Paul is encouraging us in this passage to look out for number one. But because we are Christians, and because we follow the way of the cross, number one is one's neighbor and not oneself. A preview of chapter 2, verses 25 through chapter 3 and verse 5. Epaphroditus is coming. His story is interesting. Why did Paul include this story in his letter? We'll talk about that next time, I hope. And then in chapter 3, he starts his appeal against circumcision and against listening to the Judaizing teachers. We'll talk more about that later. I hope you have a good week and a good Saturday. God bless.